Welcome to the PAWSCAST, and now here are our hosts.
Hi everybody, welcome to our PAWSCAST on marijuana. Today we're joined with Michael Bice. He is an instructor here in the psychology department at Frostburg State University. And I'm Dr. Amanda Vanderveer, and we're glad to have you today. So Michael, can you give us a little background about marijuana? Like what's THC and CBD and what's the difference? And what about Delta-8? What's all that mean?
Mm-hmm. It can be rather confusing. We've been dealing with marijuana since about the Stone Age. It's a plant, it's an herb, it's been around for a long period of time. And so what you find when people look at street marijuana, they're typically looking at THC-based tetrahydrocannabinol 9. There's a compound that can be synthesized from THC called CBD, which is cannabidiol. THC is psychoactive, meaning it will get you high, it will change your mental functioning, you'll begin to feel like you're under the influence of something. CBD, which is extracted from marijuana, is not psychoactive, so it doesn't have any of those concerns. You're not going to get a DWI from driving under the influence of CBD.
Okay.
When we look at Delta-8, this is an interesting dilemma here because you have THC-9, which is tetrahydrocannabinol 9, also known as Delta-9.
Okay.
Delta-8 is one molecule away from THC. The difference is that unless you have a medical marijuana card, Delta-9 is illegal. Delta-8 can be bought at a lot of the shops that you see around town. It has a lot of similar effects to marijuana, but it's marketed as a hemp product. But there's one major catch. If you use it like you traditionally use marijuana, which is how people typically do, and it's manufactured as a hemp, then if you take a drug test, it will show up positive for THC. Now, the good news is there is a test that will tell you if you took Delta-8 or THC. The bad news is it costs $1,200 just to isolate and confirm that in fact you did take Delta-8.
And I'm sure employers are going to be willing to put that.
No, they're gonna put that on the impetus of the person being tested. And even if you get confirmation, they're going to say, okay, that's great, you took Delta-8, but it's THC based, and we're testing for THC. Unless you have a medical marijuana card, you're not supposed to be taking this anyway. So that $1,200 will confirm that you were telling the truth, but it likely won't make much of a difference. So in looking at that, a lot of people may be thinking, hey, I'm taking something that's hemp-based. And for years, people have been using hemp products. Hair products, shampoos that prevent women from getting split ends, things like that. Makes really strong roots for hair. Hemp does a really good job. It's a really strong fiber for ropes, ship sails, but it's THC-based in terms of that Delta-8. And so people are going to find that when they take that, they're going to have similar effects to taking marijuana, and they're going to have similar problems if they're subject to drug testing and a lot of explaining, and they'll likely be pretty upset because they'll be like, this is what I took. And when you dig down into that, it really is a THC-based product. It is legal in terms of how that goes, and so that's likely designed to present some issues that way. It's very similar in terms of a legal loophole to what we saw with K2 and bath salts here probably about 10 years ago. K2 was the synthetic marijuana, and bath salts were the synthetic cocaine, where there was a legal loophole that you could buy these things. Now you can't, but at that time you could buy these things legally. Nobody ever closed the loophole. For whatever reason, nobody ever closed the Delta-8 loophole. It's unlikely that they're probably going to do that, especially with a recreational marijuana referendum here in November that the voters are going to decide in Maryland whether recreational marijuana is going to be legal or not.
So you mentioned the CBD. If someone's taking CBD, will they test positive for THC if they do a drug test?
That's tricky too, because traditionally, if you were taking CBD, you should not test positive for THC. However, due to poor quality controls and contamination, there's a lot of contamination of CBD samples with THC because they're manufactured in a lot of the same environments. And so what happens is a person may say, I just took this CBD gummy, and there may be enough in there with THC, enough contamination with THC to cause a positive on a drug screen. A lot of people have reported that. So you say, well, maybe people were just lying. People say, hey, this is what I took. I'll show you the bottle. And they're not understanding that due to poor quality controls, things along those lines, there's a certain percentage of CBD that has THC mixed in. If you look at medical marijuana, that is a percentage of THC to CBD. Anywhere from, you get to pick, if you go to a dispensary, you get to pick how much THC versus how much CBD.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that THC is more expensive than CBD, although it takes an extra process to extract. You would think it would be the other way around. But a person can choose THC to CBD ratio anyway, and so that's probably why a lot of CBD products, people aren't too concerned about making sure that there's no THC in there, either intentionally or probably accidentally.
Right. And so you also mentioned the legal changes that are coming up in the future, the possible legal ramifications and stuff. Would you like to talk more about that?
Sure. Currently what we have in Maryland is a drug experimentation law. That's the way it suffices. So it's basically a 3 strikes and you're out law, where, and what we mean by out is after the 3rd time of these certain conditions, then penalties go back to what they were before the laws were in place. So those conditions are, at 3 times you can be caught with less than 10 grams in your possession. After the 3rd time or the 4th time, then penalties revert back to what they were. That's considered a decriminalization law, but a lot of times it serves as an experimentation law. Because what happens is you have people who experimented with marijuana, maybe in their college or high school years, got caught with it, and now because of those charges, they can't get certain grants and certain funding, and they have this label on them that they carry with for the rest of their lives that was unfair. So it's like, okay, let's make sure that we're not having people that are dealing marijuana, and let's keep in mind the idea that if people chose to experiment with that, we'll give them a 3 time leeway. It's 3 time life leeway, and then penalties go back to the way that they were. There initially was 3 times less than 10 grams, but paraphernalia didn't count. They changed that, so now the paraphernalia does, not count against an individual, because most of the time, if a person had marijuana, they'd probably have paraphernalia use it. That is possibly going to change this November in Maryland, because we're going to have a referendum in Maryland that's going to look at, the voters are going to decide by majority vote whether or not recreational marijuana is going to be legal. And if that passes in November, then June 2023, anybody over the age of 21 will be able to use recreational marijuana. Not too sure about the specifics yet. If you look at similar laws, like in Colorado, places like that, there's laws around how many plants you can have and what stage they're in, if they're flowering or whatever the case might be. So we'll see how that goes. What they are saying, though, is that they will go back and reverse some of those low-level marijuana drug convictions automatically if the law does pass. And they think it's going to pass in every county except for Allegheny and Garrett. But with a lot of the permissiveness that we see around marijuana use and a lot of ways that people view that differently, I think you'll probably see it pass in every county in Maryland.
Yeah, especially with our older population up here and the proliferation of CBD. Like, a lot of people in the older population tends to use CBD from the people I know. So talking about that, why do people smoke or use THC marijuana?
They use it for a lot of reasons. Some people use it to help with pain. Some people use it to help with sleep. Some people use it to help with depression and anxiety. But one of the things that people overlook is that if a person has trouble sleeping, there's a reason that they have trouble sleeping.
Right.
So if they take marijuana, that will help them with their insomnia or sleep, but it's dealing with the symptoms, but it's not dealing with the underlying issue. So what's going to happen is a person's going to continue to use marijuana, they're going to continue to sleep, but at some point, their body's going to develop a tolerance to that. And when it does, it's not going to help with their insomnia, and now they're back to the drawing board because the marijuana won't help, and most people experience a rebound effect to where whatever issue that was treating, now it gets worse instead of better. That may take a while, it may take years, everybody's body's different. But in looking at that with any medication, if you're only treating the symptoms and not the underlying cause, then you have to wonder what's going to happen when this doesn't work. And when that happens, people could find themselves in crisis at that time.
And that's really what pharmaceuticals do too, for the most part. There's a large market for treating the symptoms and not the root cause of the issue. So,
Tommy Tomasello, I think his name was, he was a instructor at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. He's now retired. He was an addictions counselor and worked at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. And his responsibility was, he was the addictions counselor to pharmacists. So when pharmacists would say, hey, I have this drug problem, he would say, okay, I know the pharmacology behind that. Here's the truth. Here's how that works. He mentioned in a training that I went to many years ago that opiates were the first line of defense for pain simply because of medical malpractice. If you cause undue suffering, that's what's going to cause a medical malpractice charge. But he said in terms of looking at the pain, he says you really have to encourage a doctor to look at those underlying causes to see what's causing the pain so you can treat that and thereby not necessarily need the opiates, but might need something else. And he gave a lot of good examples in terms of how that worked. But you're right. When we treat the symptom and not the problem, then we're kind of borrowing time. And then what happens when our symptomatic treatments no longer work?
Right, exactly. So if, we all know that people can become addicted to opioids, can you become addicted to marijuana? And how do you know when use turns into addiction?
Basically, when we look at marijuana addiction, what we're looking at is we're looking at this DSM criteria, which is the same across all substances. But the bottom line is the issue of control and the issue of what a person is using it for begins to change. And there's varieties of mild, moderate, and severe, but some examples are a person using marijuana for longer than intended. And when you look at some of these criteria, people say, well, I just decided to use it for longer than I intended. But when you set a limit for yourself and you exceed that, when you spend a great deal of time obtaining it, when you begin to have problems in your life, socially with family members, people say, hey, we're concerned about that. Recurrent patterns of that, tolerance, needing more marijuana to achieve the same effect, and then the withdrawal. For a long time, people were like, well, there's not really a syndrome of withdrawal for marijuana. That clearly is, and in DSM-5, they finally recognized that and said it's irritability. Everybody's familiar with caffeine irritability.
Oh, yeah.
Well, with marijuana irritability, that goes to a whole other ballgame, and so you begin to see that a person having problems in their life, this is the reason for those problems, and you begin to see the criteria start to build up. The criteria says, you only need 2 for mild, 3 to 5 for moderate, 6 or more for severe, but the more issues that a person has in their life that are caused by marijuana, more problems, then what you begin to see as you start to get into that area of addiction.
Yeah. And what about amotivational syndrome? What's that about? Because there's that mental connection that DARE programs and stuff have tried to make, that drugs actually lead to less motivation for students, for example. So is that true?
It is true. Now, the problem with amotivational syndrome is it's correlated with marijuana use. We haven't been able to establish a direct tie. But amotivational syndrome is the, dude, where's my car? Dude, you don't have a car. Right. It's your mom's Oldsmobile. Oh, okay. But in looking at that, amotivational syndrome is something that over time, a person generally becomes less active and interested in activities. It's hard for them, because it's so gradual, to notice that change. It's usually noticed by family members. And family members will say, you used to be into sports and used to have these hobbies. And people are like, well, I grew up and I got involved in other things. Family members can see the change over time more easily than an individual.
Right.
When most people think of being burnt from marijuana in terms of that cognitive functioning, usually a lot of times what they're referring to is that amotivational syndrome, and there's a pretty strong correlational relationship that people get concerned about in terms of how that works.
Yeah, and that doesn't sound like something that college students want to experience, because it makes it harder to study, to learn.
Right. Well,
to go to class at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Well, the scariest thing is could I be using marijuana? This be happening to me, and I have to have somebody tell me.
Right.
Amotivational syndrome is like bad breath and body odor. You usually only find out about those things unless somebody tells you.
Right.
So in looking at that, somebody would have to say, hey man, you're just not as sharp as what you used to be. And if my friends are doing something similar to what I'm doing, then it's going to be harder for them to spot it.
Right.
And so in looking at that, that's not meant to make people fearful, but it's one of those things of, how would I know that that's not creeping up on me? Somebody's going to have to observe it, care enough about me to tell me, and point that out to me.
Yeah, and that takes a lot of inner strength and leadership to be able to talk to somebody and say, hey, I don't know what's going on, but this isn't good.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. So if someone were to choose to use marijuana, are there safe ways to do it? Like, what about smoking? Does smoking cause cancer for marijuana?
The answer to that is marijuana does not cause cancer. But when you start to see the relationship that people make between marijuana and cancer, that is usually modulated by the smoking.
Okay.
If you think about how, hookah and different things aside, if you think about how people smoke marijuana, they typically inhale longer and deeper into the lungs. What we know is that one joint, now they never define a joint, how big, how small it is, or the marijuana, but they never define that. But one joint is equal to 15 cigarettes, tobacco-based cigarettes, on the respiratory system. So when you start to look at the relationship between marijuana and cancer, it's related to the smoking. In terms of the safer ways, it's always tricky because when you talk about safe ways to use a drug, that always gets weird because people start to look at that as permission, but there are some general guidelines. One is that you would want to move maybe more towards CBD than THC because the CBD is not psychoactive. Now, when you look at some of the data behind anxiety and PTSD, a lot of people who use CBD say that doesn't help, only the THC based. So now we're back to the psychoactive elements. But CBD would be a better route to go. Not smoking it would be better because of the negative health effects of smoking. And 3 is buying from a dispensary because in looking at that, for years in the literature, they said, marijuana can be laced with cocaine, fentanyl, whatever. We're seeing that. We've seen that, off and on for a period of, 5 to 7 years. And so in looking at that, when you're getting medical marijuana from the dispensary, you know that it's not laced with fentanyl, and so it's not going to have those additives. You're going to pay a little bit more, considerably more than what you would street value, but because most of your street dealers are selling other types of drugs, either accidental or intentional contamination, you don't have to worry about those issues. So,
and fentanyl is a huge risk.
Absolutely.
It's scary.
Absolutely, yeah. 1 microgram of that is enough to kill you. A lot of people have seen a lot of the public service announcements where, a couple of salt shakers full of that. But then people have also seen the YouTube video where these people dip their hands in so-called fentanyl and go like this, and then they're fine. That doesn't fit with how we believe fentanyl works. That should have, knocked them flat and killed them.
That was probably not fentanyl.
Right, absolutely. So in looking at that, staying away from smoking, focus more on CBD, looking at a dispensary simply because that way you know exactly what you're getting from an individual and don't have to worry about some of these contaminants.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, the ideal situation is a person would choose not to use marijuana at all. But if people were saying, hey, how can I limit the risk as much as possible, those 3 things would be things that someone would keep in mind.
Yeah. So when talking about using it, I saw some research studies that came out that said that using marijuana prevents COVID. What are your thoughts?
What we saw early on in the pandemic for people who did addictions counseling was some early warning signs. And one of those early warning signs was the dangers of smoking, and in particular vaping, for people who contracted COVID. That basically if you got that you would likely have a longer course of COVID and that it could be a more fatal course. That seemed to be, despite, weight issues and all these different health things, the one consistent that seemed to come out of that was the negative benefits of smoking with COVID. So I'm not really sure how smoked marijuana would necessarily help someone with COVID in terms of how that goes. If you look at it and say, okay, we're looking at maybe edible marijuana. When you look at edible marijuana, there's a relationship of you need about 3 times the amount of marijuana in an edible that you do in smoked form. That's because the stomach does a very good job of digesting and destroying things. So you need about 3 times more marijuana in, let's say, a marijuana brownie than you would in a joint. But even if you look at, let's say we're going to use marijuana brownies to, help prevent COVID. Marijuana, like many drugs of abuse, has an immunosuppressant effect. So it suppresses the immune system. This is the reason why students can't drink alcohol and avoid the flu. Is because alcohol suppresses the immune system. And so in looking at that, even if you look at it from that angle, that research would have to be very suspect because of those immunosuppressive effects. If it was smoking, we know that doesn't help people with COVID. The immunosuppressive effects, you're suppressing the immune system, and that doesn't sound like something that would help with COVID either.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I know, we were talking beforehand, both of us are from Gen X, And it seems like millennials and Gen Z are very much more open to marijuana use than Gen Xers and the boomers who came before us. So I know from my experience, for a long time, pot was considered to be a really bad drug. Like, it's a gateway drug, and my generation grew up with the scrambled egg in the frying pan. This is your brain on drugs. So it was ingrained into my generation that there was a lot of risks. If you're smoking pot, you could end up, I don't know, tripping or dropping acid, like shooting up heroin. Like, you could just go from marijuana to that all the way. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts about that? Can it really lead you to that?
Okay. That's a complicated question to answer, but we'll do our best here. In looking
that was a lot of words too, so
yeah,
sorry.
That's okay. In looking at that, I think when you ask different generations how they feel about marijuana, you'll be likely to find a response that says, okay, you would see that generational distinction. Mm-hmm. But when in actually interacting with people, when they would actually get really, really honest or do surveys where you would ask them their thoughts on marijuana, I think you'll find those generations are more similar than different. Mm. Marijuana is now being seen as lesser of an evil than fentanyl, and obviously, it can't really be compared, but it is still a drug. It's the question of which is more dangerous, a knife or a gun, and the answer is it depends on who has it. If you have a knife expert that has the knife, well, that could be just as deadly, if not deadlier, than a gun. In terms of your question with marijuana, the idea behind this is your brain on drugs, that was one of those, although considered very influential campaigns, it failed in terms of the public eye. It created an image, but there was a significant portion of the population who didn't get it. Mm-hmm. Oh, it turns your brain into eggs? Well, I like eggs. Mm-hmm. No, that really wasn't what the case was. And also, it didn't fit the experience of people who were recreational drug users, who had straight A students and they were successful athletes. And so for those people, it's like, well, when's my brain going to turn to mush? It didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So that blanket statement of this is your brain on drugs, it really misled a lot of people to thinking it was more deterministic. And so what happened is that people said, well, if that message is wrong, then all the messages are wrong. If you look at the history of marijuana laws very briefly, marijuana, in particular hemp, was an import from Mexico for many years in the United States. But in the early 1900s, there was this thing called the Mexican Revolution. Mm-hmm. And what happened is a lot of individuals were fleeing Mexico across the border in the early 1900s to flee violence and persecution. Yeah. And what happened, that influx of immigrants caused a lot of negative backlash. Does this start to sound familiar? It sounds very familiar. And what happened is that in 1934, we had what's called the Marijuana Tax Act, which now took this crop that was imported into the country and put a tax on it. Something else important happened at that time. If you look at marijuana's traditional correct spelling, it's Marihuana. The Marijuana Tax Act changed that to Marijuna, and that was intentional because what they wanted to do, Henry Anslinger, who was the first director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was an early precursor to the DEA, he made that change specifically so that if you were using marijuana, and obviously when the immigrants came over, they brought marijuana with them, it was one of those major crops. But if you were using marijuana, then you were on the side of the immigrants. And so they changed that word to make it look like it was more Spanish, and so then that carried an additional racial message. Mr. Anslinger himself had a lot to say about people of color who used marijuana and some of the racist concerns that he has. I won't, give them an audience here, but a person can look up Henry Anslinger, views on marijuana, and so it had a lot to do with negative views around people of color. And so with that Marijuana Tax Act, then that goes into effect, and so that effectively shuts down any study of marijuana, things along those lines. The Supreme Court would find that illegal and unconstitutional in 1969. The following year, the Controlled Substances Act kicks in. The Controlled Substances Act is the one where most people understand, okay, drugs are on 5 schedules, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 is all your illegal drugs. That Controlled Substances Act put marijuana in Schedule 1. No research unless federally approved, and LSD, cocaine, but even those drugs, if you applied for a permit to study them, you'd have a better luck studying cocaine or LSD than you would marijuana. So that set it back. So when the Controlled Substance Act carried through until 2018, so from the 1969 all the way to 2018, the Farm Bill, there was a Farm Bill that took hemp out of the Controlled Substances Act. 2018, now people can do research on hemp, CBD, THC, and we can begin to find out, is there anything behind this that could really be helpful? But we've really been behind the mark on that in terms of how that goes. So that's a brief history of marijuana law. And so there's a racial message there. The reason why in the 80s people had those strong messages is because that was intentional. Between immigration, the racial implications that people, there was a very clear message. And even though marijuana was a cause for concern, it wasn't as scary as what they were making it out to be. Back to your original question is, can marijuana be harmful? It can be. The amotivational syndrome comes into play. The one that concerns me the most is when a person uses marijuana, it creates a 50% increase in heart rate. And when I think of a 50% increase in heart rate, the first thing that comes to my mind is a brain aneurysm or a blood vessel. You usually don't realize that you have one of those until it bursts. When it bursts, it's usually bad news. People survive them, but not always. That's the one that really jumps out at me. So when people say, I hear people overdosing and dying on marijuana. Well, if that 50% increase in heart rate, brain aneurysm, or could cause some other type of cardiovascular problem for you, you could be in a problem with that in terms of how that goes. So those are the main mechanisms. Obviously, they're few and far between. They're not, the things that we see with other drugs of abuse, but those are the major ways that marijuana can be harmful to an individual in terms of how that goes.
Wow. Yeah. So, talking about, we mentioned amotivational syndrome and how it can affect college students. Can it affect brain development in children, in college student age kids, differently than it does with adults?
We learned a lot of this from a lot of the tobacco research, which is the adolescent brain. When we talk about the adolescent brain, we talk about adolescence up until the early 20s, where most traditional college students are, going to college. And so when you look at that, the brain at that period of time is very sensitized to novel experiences. That's why the alcohol tastes so good. That's why the cigarettes seem so sharp, is because the brain is sensitized to those experiences. The problem is that that's the same period of time developmentally when a person is learning how to make friends and influence people. And when I'm taking a major mood altering substance, psychoactive such as marijuana, at the same time that I'm learning those important facts, and what's going to happen is emotional maturity and cognitive, those types of things are going to be hampered in some way. To what degree? It's probably not going to put you in the corner sucking your thumb. But what would that development look like without, those things coming into play? And that's the huge concern with the developing young adult, adolescent developing brain. What are some of those things, those processes that drugs of abuse, not just marijuana, but the others, will impact negatively that otherwise wouldn't be there?
And with brains that are still forming, I've seen the general accepted age is 25. That by the time you're 25, your brain's pretty much done its formation, its developmental formation. But now I'm starting to see research saying it could be up to 30. So your brain is changing in these long periods of time, and throwing some psychotropics into it.
And of course, the pushback everybody says is, that applies to pharmaceuticals. It applies to all of it. You have to be mindful of what you put on board, and there are pros and cons to everything. But when people say, well, there's only pros to this and no cons, you have to look at it in a balanced way and say, am I really giving it due diligence? Am I being fair to my brain? Am I being fair to the developing brain to figure out what the right course of action is?
And going back to that discussion about, are we treating the symptoms, or are we treating the root cause? Absolutely. So, so in general, it seems that pot seems to be good in some ways, possibly, and bad in others. So it should be really, what do you think about leaving it up to the discretion of the individual versus legalization? What are your thoughts on that? That's a big question.
It is. I think we're already there. I think with medicinal marijuana, I think we're already there. in terms of people that have made their choice. People that are watching this video, they've already made their choice, whether or not marijuana is something they're going to do or not. What they may not have thought about are some of the implications of things to be mindful of. That's probably not enough to change a person's behavior, but hopefully the goal of this, obviously, since there's been so much fear mongering and things along those lines around marijuana, is to get people to think about, what am I putting into my body? What is it really helping with? And is this a good long-term strategy? So I think we're really there in terms of the individual. We talk about immunosuppression and, if I'm at the end of stage of my life because I have some type of terminal illness, marijuana will stimulate my appetite, but it's lowering my immune system. So am I trading one benefit for the other? And so that's where people really have to make some difficult decisions to figure out what's best for them. Is it better to have a shorter quality of life? Is it that's higher quality? Is it better for them to have a longer life but maybe a shorter quality? And that's really where it comes down to the individual. And you could probably survey 10,000 people and get responses all over the board of people would say, no, I'd rather live longer, and others would say, well, I just rather have higher quality even if in that shorter period of time. So I think that we're really there. I think that the way the laws are moving is going to allow people to make those decisions, and along with a provider, their families, things along those lines, it really get into some difficult issues about what's best for the individual.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So, could you talk to us about what type of resources are available to students on campus struggling with maybe potential addiction to marijuana?
Absolutely. We have the Berg Peer Network, which is always a good source of information. We have the CAP Center, the Counseling and Psychological Services, where we have, the Berg Peer Network is a little bit more peer-to-peer, and it's a little more student-to-student. If somebody's looking for something a little more formal, then CAPS is probably the way to go. And CAPS can decide whether or not they want to, provide some counseling there, or if they want to use one of the numerous agencies in the community that provide addictions treatment. One word of note is that if a person does seek out professional help in terms of looking at marijuana use, and people say, well, how many people really do that? They do. People do it all the time because they believe their marijuana use is out of control. They believe a medical marijuana card will not help them. When they go to pursue that, a lot of the current trends are towards pushing them towards medical marijuana. And you have to make it a point to tell a provider, I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for something that's abstinence-based. I'm looking to get away from marijuana. And then, you'd see people starting to honor those wishes. But since the medical marijuana is extremely popular right now, a lot of times it's looking at how a person could do that legally as opposed to the individual who says, no, I want to stop completely. And so, a word of note for people who are looking at that, to keep that in mind and make sure they would let their provider know that that's the direction they're headed so they can get, the proper treatment to move in that direction.
Yeah. And that's one thing I forgot to ask you about how many people using marijuana. Do you know the percentage of how many of those people might have an addictions issue?
That's really difficult because it's going to depend upon the reasons for them taking it in terms of how that goes. It's really hard to put a number on that.
Yeah, how do you decipher that?
Right.
That's a
But one thing's for sure is that when the topic comes up, people very clearly know whether or not that's a concern. You start to see some of the defensiveness. You start to see where if marijuana's not an issue for me, okay, then I'll just answer the question. Why are you asking that? What do you need to know about that? And there's all sorts of things about, certain rights that people have, gun rights, things like that come into play, get tricky with medical marijuana cards and things along those lines. And so people sometimes say, they don't like those benefits of it. But it's hard to figure that out in terms of how that goes. But when you start to look at the criteria and the motivation that a person is using behind the marijuana, then those addiction issues to a trained professional start to stand out pretty starkly. And so then you start to see, okay, this is kind of what I'm dealing with. The main issue is that people who have marijuana addictions, a lot of times they come to treatment because someone in their life is concerned about them. And so, okay, why are you here? Well, my family thinks this is a problem. And that fits with addiction as a general rule. Most of the people who come to addictions treatment come because there's somebody in their life that says, this needs to stop, cut down, change. And so they don't necessarily at that point believe it's an issue. Somebody else does. And so getting consent and getting those people involved in their care and finding out what are you seeing and how does that fit into what a person's doing, a lot of those can help shed light on, some of the criteria and help people see or help begin to swim into focus whether or not it's an addiction issue or whether it's just something that a person does.
Yeah, and I've seen like 10% batted around, but there's no like deep discussion as to how they've come to that 10% or what the qualifications are. So yeah, and I think it is something more self-identified, or your family helps you to identify that issue, and then going to a mental health professional to be evaluated properly, to be able to see what really is going on there is important.
When you look at the original medical marijuana legislation in Maryland, it made it all the way to the last legislative review. There was a clause in there that said that before a person could get a medical marijuana card, they would have to be evaluated to make sure that there were no, at that time the phrase was the abuse and dependence issue. Now it's substance use disorder. That didn't make it into the final translation, probably because separating that out could become very, very difficult.
Right.
In terms of how that goes. But having a conversation with somebody and having a conversation with a trained professional who is helping to figure out, is there an addiction issue? Because that's a myth too. Everybody thinks, okay, if I go see an addictions counselor, they're going to find something because they're thinking of the medical model. But the counseling model says, you know what, we think you're healthier than what you believe you might be, and so we're trying to find what's right with you.
Yeah.
And addictions counseling that way is that there's plenty of people out there who need it. If somebody comes by who doesn't, when they get evaluated, they're not going to be recommended just for the heck of it. They're going to be recommended because there's some concerns there, and there's some criteria that's met that warrant further discussion, warrant diagnosis, warrant some more treatment.
Yeah, and I think addictions counselors want to empower the individual and not, blame, shame, guilt them or anything like that.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit, there are addictions counselors, of course, available in the community. Are there any other resources that you can think of that are available for people struggling with addictions, marijuana addictions in the community?
A lot of good resources is when you start to talk to certified peer recovery specialists. These are people who are in recovery, and what you'll find is that the overwhelming majority of them have battled substance use from a variety of substances. They'll be the first ones to tell you medical marijuana wouldn't have worked for them. There was never an option for them, but they had to give up all mood altering substances. So I think it's always helpful to talk to a person who's been there and done that. AHEC West, Healing Allegheny, those are some of the places where they can get you in touch with a peer who can say, okay, tell me what you think about marijuana. They're allowed to share their experience, so they'll say, here's why I think that might not work. Here's why that wouldn't work for me. And so you can talk to someone who has, 5, 10, 15, 20 years of recovery who says, this wouldn't work for me. And if I'm sitting in that chair hearing how it didn't work for them, then I have to start to think about, well, yeah, they might be different than me, but if it didn't work for them, what's the odds that it would work for me? Those are good resources too, is to talk to somebody who has dealt with and worked through the other side of that. And so then they can be a good source of information to help a person figure out if that's a good route for them to go.
Yeah, great. Is there anything that we didn't cover today that you would like to touch on? No,
I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about marijuana. It's such a hot topic and people feel so strongly about it. And so then when we can separate the emotion and just talk about, the facts behind marijuana, what we know, what we don't know, to help people make informed decisions. And then we're moving away from, the 1936 reefer madness where people turned into werewolves and, like you had said, all these psychoses. Only about 1% of the population has a psychosis type reaction. So if you were to go into a mental health program with people who deal with like schizophrenia, things like that, and you'd say, hey, what do you think about marijuana? They'd be like, oh, no.
Yeah.
Well, why not? It makes them more paranoid, things along those lines. Or you talk to people who say, I didn't like marijuana when I smoked it, it made me really paranoid. That tends to be related to further mental health problems, and in particular, it seems to be a warning sign to psychosis. So looking at that isn't a fear technique. It's just if you have that experience, now you're in a percentage of people, which isn't very big, that happens to, something to look at further. So I think when people can look at, not try to figure out which political affiliation or try to figure out all these arbitrary things, when you can look at marijuana fact-based and say, okay, here's the facts, whether I agree with them or not, whether I dislike them or not, doesn't make them any more or less true. But that helps people make informed decisions, and they can say, yeah, I think it's for me, or I didn't think about that, and maybe I need to think about it further before I delve even farther into it than maybe I already am.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, we're not trying to do Fox News here or MSNBC by any means. We're trying to educate people on the issues so that they can make an informed decision for themselves. And I think that's super important.
That's the biggest thing that any addictions counselor will tell you is the phone rings all week long, and it's people who say, listen, I've heard whatever it is about a particular drug. Is that true?
Yeah.
And there's been so much misinformation, and it's so hard to get accurate information that's what people want. They want accurate information so they can make an informed opinion, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking with us today. We really appreciate it. And if you guys want more information about it, you can come to the SAFE office. We have your educators there who are more than happy to talk to you about any of these topics. We can also, as Michael mentioned, refer you to other offices. There's CAPS. There's all sorts of options out there for you, so you can make an educated decision for yourselves. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you for being a part of our PAWSCAST. This health and wellness podcast is brought to you by the Prevention Center and the Peer Education Network at Frostburg State University. If you would like more information about our programs, visit us in Pullen Hall 109 or call us at 301-687-4761. Or you could also send us an email at safeoffice@frostburg.edu.